Ever get that feeling where you're like, I really want to understand this complex thing, you know? But just the thought of wading through all their research is like, forget it.
Yeah, totally. I know exactly what you mean.
Well, that is why this show exists. Welcome to the Deep Dive, where
Yeah.
we do all that waiting for you. And today we're taking a shortcut through a really interesting area of educational psychology. It's all about how we think about knowledge itself.
Yeah, think of it as like the express lane to understanding what's called personal epistemology.
Oh, okay.
So basically, it's all about the beliefs we have about knowledge and knowing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we know things? What even is knowledge? That kind of stuff.
Right.
We've been digging into a really thorough article from the Educational Psychology Review. It's called Domain Generality and Domain Specificity in Personal Epistemology Research: Philosophical and Empirical Reflections in the Development of a Theoretical Framework.
Wow, that is a mouthful.
It is a long one.
Mm-hmm.
The authors are Krista Muse, Lisa Bendixson, and Florian Harrell.
All right, so personal epistemology. It does sound a little jargony, but it's really just about your own personal theory of knowledge. Like, how do you know what you know?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what are your assumptions about how knowledge works?
Right.
And we're going to unpack this core question.
Right.
Are those theories, those assumptions, are they kind of consistent across the board? Like whether you're trying to figure out a historical event or a scientific concept, or do your beliefs about knowledge shift depending on the subject you're dealing with? And believe it or not, the answer to that actually has some pretty big implications for the way we learn and the way we teach.
So this is all about how do we know what we know? And is that a consistent thing across different areas of life, or does it vary depending on what we're learning about?
Exactly. And to give you a little background, this whole area really has deep roots in philosophy. I mean, for centuries, philosophers have been wrestling with these fundamental questions about knowledge, like what are the limits of human knowledge? Where does knowledge come from? What even makes a belief count as knowledge? And so traditionally, they've explored things like the scope of what humans can understand, the different sources of knowledge, like our senses, our memory, reasoning, and the very nature of knowing itself. What justifies our beliefs?
So this is like classic, sit in an armchair, smoke your pipe kind of philosophy.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Starting around the 1970s, thanks to researchers like Perry, these big philosophical questions began to be investigated empirically. So instead of just theorizing about it, researchers actually started to study what people believe about how we come to know things.
Okay.
So they started looking at the assumptions people have about knowing, the structure of those beliefs, how those beliefs influence our thinking and our motivation.
So it went from like thought experiments to actual experiments.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's become a much more hands-on field of study.
Okay, so what have they found?
Well, one of the most fascinating things is that there's a real connection between what you believe about knowledge and how you process information, how motivated you are to learn, the kinds of learning strategies you use, and even how well you do in school.
Oh, wow. So my beliefs about knowledge actually impact my learning and achievement.
Yeah, it turns out that your underlying beliefs about knowledge, they can really shape how you approach a learning task, how well you understand new information, even how you go about solving problems.
Interesting.
So it's not just some abstract philosophical concept, it actually has practical implications.
Okay, so that brings us to the big question, the central puzzle we're trying to solve in this deep dive.
Right.
Is personal epistemology domain general or domain specific? In other words, do you have one set of beliefs about knowledge that applies to everything? Or does it change depending on what you're learning about?
Yeah, like are your standards for knowing something in math totally different from your standards for knowing something in literature? Or is it all kind of the same underlying process?
Right. Like, do I have just one knowledge meter in my brain, or do I have a bunch of specialized ones for different topics?
Great question. And actually, there's been a lot of research trying to figure that out. Some really influential research, like the work of Schamer and Walker, Schamer-Akins, and our colleagues, has suggested that, yeah, our epistemic beliefs tend to be fairly consistent.
Okay.
They've found these patterns in how people think about knowledge that seem to hold true regardless of the specific subject.
So like one knowledge meter.
Yeah, like a general set of beliefs about what it means to know something.
Okay, so case closed.
Well, not quite. There's another camp of researchers, folks like Hofer, Paulson, and Wells, who have found evidence pointing in the opposite direction. Their work suggests our beliefs about knowledge can actually be quite specific to the domain or the subject.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So for example, what you believe about what it means to know something in science might be totally different from what you believe about knowing something in history, like what counts as evidence might be different, or how certain you can be about your knowledge.
That makes sense. I guess the way we prove things in science is pretty different from the way we analyze historical events.
Exactly. And then it gets even more interesting because there's a third viewpoint that suggests it might not be an either-or situation.
Yeah.
Like maybe it's not just one or the other.
Okay.
Researchers like Buell and Alexander, even Hofer herself, have proposed that our beliefs can be both general and specific, and that there might be really important ways these general beliefs and specific beliefs interact.
So, like, maybe there are some overarching principles about knowledge that I apply across the board, but then I also make adjustments based on the specific subject.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you might have a general strategy for problem solving, but the specific steps you take will totally depend on whether you're fixing a leaky faucet or trying to write a poem.
I like that analogy.
And Sternberg actually suggested this whole debate, domain generality versus domain specificity, might be kind of a false dichotomy. Like maybe it's not a question of one being right and the other being wrong. Maybe it's more nuanced than that. Maybe different types of epistemologies are just more relevant or dominant in different areas of knowledge, as Cummins has proposed. But at the same time, the article points out that some researchers, Blanke and her colleagues, Kitchener and King, even going back to Perry, have found similar developmental patterns in how these beliefs become more sophisticated over time across different domains. So the way we think about knowledge might mature in a similar way, even if the content of those beliefs is different depending on the subject.
Okay, so maybe there's both a general path of development and some specific variations depending on what we're learning. What about this multidimensional perspective the article talks about?
Yes. This is a really key perspective, especially associated with Schammer's work. So this view suggests that different aspects of our beliefs about knowledge, like how certain we think knowledge is, how structured it is, where it comes from, how it's justified, all those things might vary depending on our overall approach to knowing. Like, do we tend to rely more on personal experience or empirical evidence or maybe logical analysis? But developmentally, you might still see a similar progression in each of those dimensions, from viewing knowledge as absolute and fixed to seeing it as more relative and open to interpretation.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get the picture here. It's complicated.
It is, but it's also really fascinating.
Yeah, totally. But I think our listeners might be wondering at this point, why does all this even matter? Like, who cares if my beliefs about knowledge are general or specific? How does this affect my life?
That's a great question. And Schraw actually lays out some really compelling reasons why this matters. First of all, it's hugely important for developing accurate ways to measure these beliefs. Like if my beliefs about knowledge in math are totally different from my beliefs about knowledge in English, asking me the same general questions about knowledge isn't going to tell us much about either one, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. It'd be like trying to measure my height and my weight with the same tool.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So understanding the domain issue is crucial for building better measurement tools. The tools we have now have faced some challenges, with consistency, with validity. Are they really measuring what we think they're measuring?
Right.
And the domain question is really at the heart of that.
Makes sense.
And the second reason this matters is because it really influences how we understand the connection between these beliefs and our cognition and motivation, like how we think and how motivated we are to learn.
Okay.
If your beliefs are really domain specific, they might have a much stronger impact on how you learn that particular subject. So for instance, what you believe about knowing in history might directly affect how you approach studying for a history exam, how you process the information, how deeply you engage with material.
Right.
On the other hand, more general beliefs might play a bigger role in your overall motivation to learn, your engagement with learning in general, regardless of the specific subject.
So specific beliefs might be like fine-tuning the learning process for a particular subject, and general beliefs might be like setting the overall volume for how much you're into learning in the first place.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Now, the article also brings up this really important point about the philosophical foundations of personal epistemology. And they point out that sometimes the field has been criticized for not being as grounded in traditional philosophical ideas about knowledge as it could be.
Yeah, and that's why the authors of this article very intentionally bring in some key philosophical concepts. They want to define personal epistemology more clearly and provide a stronger framework for understanding this whole question of whether beliefs are general or specific.
Okay, so they're trying to bridge the gap between philosophy and psychology here.
Exactly. And they give us this really helpful overview of some historical and contemporary philosophical perspectives on knowledge, which gives us a broader context for thinking about this whole domain issue.
Okay.
And a key takeaway from all that is that different fields of study, different academic disciplines, might naturally have different dominant ways of understanding what counts as knowledge.
So a historian and a physicist might have different ideas about what it means to know something.
Exactly. Because the methods they use, the types of evidence they rely on, the level of certainty they could achieve, all of that might be different.
And that leads into the next point the article makes, which is about the importance of having a clear definition of academic domain knowledge.
Right. They emphasize that we need to be really clear about what we mean by an academic domain in the first place.
Okay.
And they point to the work of folks like Alexander and his colleagues, Bigland, Spiro, and Zhang, and Fredrickson, who have all tried to define this concept.
So basically, what makes an academic subject a distinct category?
Exactly. And the authors argue that how we define that really shapes our whole understanding of epistemic beliefs. It influences how we build theories, the methods we use to study them, how we interpret the data, and ultimately the conclusions we reach about whether beliefs are general or specific.
Right, so the very definition of a domain can affect whether we see beliefs as general or specific. It's like if we define the domain too broadly, we might miss some important nuances.
Exactly, yeah.
So how do these researchers actually differentiate between different academic domains? What are the key factors they look at?
They point to several key dimensions. One is the degree of consensus within the field. Like, is there a lot of agreement among experts in a field like physics? Or is it more like philosophy, where there are many different schools of thought and perspectives?
Okay, so how much agreement there is among the experts?
Right. Another dimension is the nature of the things the domain deals with. Are they tangible and concrete, like the objects studied in chemistry? Or are they more abstract and conceptual, like the ideas in sociology?
So concrete versus abstract, what else?
Then there's the intended application of the knowledge. Is it mostly about basic research and developing theory? Or is it focused on practical applications, like engineering?
Pure versus applied knowledge.
Right. And finally, there's the structure of the domain. Is it well-structured, with clear procedures and solutions, like many areas of mathematics? Or is it more ill-structured, with complex problems that might have multiple valid approaches, like in many social sciences?
So how clear-cut are the problems and solutions in that field?
Exactly.
These distinctions make a lot of sense. It's easy to see how learning in a field with lots of agreement and clear solutions would feel very different from learning in a field where everything's up for debate and there are no easy answers.
Right. And these distinctions aren't just theoretical. They're important for comparing how beliefs might function across different subjects, and also for thinking about how to teach and learn most effectively in different areas.
Okay, so now the article gets into this really interesting area where philosophy and psychology come together. They start looking at the epistemic beliefs of experts in different fields.
It's this fascinating question of how do we know? And how does that differ depending on what you're an expert in?
Right, like how does a historian know something versus how a physicist knows something?
Exactly. And Royce, the philosopher and psychologist, he argued that the very act of knowing is not uniform across all disciplines. So how we justify our claims in art might be totally different philosophically from how we justify claims in science. And psychologically, the cognitive processes involved might be very different too.
So the mental steps we take to understand a poem might be very different from the mental steps we take to solve a physics problem.
Precisely. And Royce also proposed that individuals have a preferred way of combining different approaches to knowing, almost like a cognitive style.
Interesting.
He identified 3 fundamental ways of knowing: rationalism, empiricism, and metaphorism.
Okay, break this down for me.
So rationalism emphasizes logical consistency, making sure your ideas fit together in a way that makes sense. Empiricism focuses on analyzing sensory information, the evidence we gather through our senses. And metaphorism is about using symbolic understanding to reach broader insights, seeing connections and patterns that go beyond the literal.
Okay, so logic, evidence, and symbolism. And Royce argued that these are the most basic ways of knowing.
Yeah, he called them basic because they're rooted in our psychological cognition, and they're also testable from an epistemological standpoint.
Okay.
And to actually measure these different ways of knowing, Royce and his colleagues developed this tool called the Psychoepistemological Profile, or PPP.
Okay, so the PP tells you what your dominant way of knowing is.
Exactly. It gives you scores for each of those 3 ways of knowing, revealing your kind of epistemological fingerprint.
cool.
Royce even hypothesized that while all three are usually involved in any kind of specialized knowledge, different fields emphasize them to different degrees.
Hmm. So, like, different fields have different epistemological recipes.
Yeah, exactly. He suggested that science typically relies most heavily on empiricism, then rationalism, then metaphorism. Social science also emphasizes empiricism, but metaphorism plays a bigger role than rationalism, maybe because there's more debate and interpretation involved.
Okay, so science is all about the evidence, but social sciences rely more on interpretation and making connections between ideas.
Right. And in literature and fine arts, metaphoric epistemology tends to be top dog. The main test there is often the universality and resonance of the insight the artist is trying to convey.
I can see that. And what about math and physics?
Well, they lean most strongly on rational epistemology, where logic and proof are everything.
Makes sense. And natural sciences, like biology and chemistry.
They're mostly about empirical evidence.
Okay, so it seems like Royce is onto something here. Different fields really do have different ways of knowing.
And research by Donald actually seems to confirm this. He found that experts within a field don't just rely on one single process for validating knowledge. And there can be variations within a field, too, depending on whether it's more theoretical or applied.
Interesting.
He also found that in well-defined and structured domains, there's less variation in how experts approach validating knowledge.
Makes sense. If there are clear rules and procedures, everyone's going to follow them pretty closely.
Right. So when we look at experts, we see both some commonalities and some distinct patterns in their epistemic beliefs. It suggests that when you compare beliefs about physics versus psychology, they might differ in terms of how certain or structured the knowledge is, but they might be similar in terms of where the knowledge comes from or how it's ultimately justified.
Okay, so there's a mix of shared and unique features in how experts think about knowledge.
Exactly.
So what about the rest of us? What about people who aren't experts? Do students' epistemic beliefs mirror these expert patterns?
That's a great question. And it leads us to the next part of the article where they review the research that's been done on students.
Okay, so how do students think about knowledge? And does it change as they go through their education?
Right. The article divides the research into two main categories: between subjects' designs and within subjects' designs. Between subjects' designs, compare the beliefs of students in different majors, while within subjects' designs, look at how individual students rate their beliefs about knowledge in different domains.
Okay, so between subjects is comparing groups of students, and within subjects is looking at how one student's beliefs differ across subjects. So
Yep.
what did they find?
Well, the 8 between subject studies they reviewed generally found support for domain specificity, meaning students in different majors did seem to have different beliefs about knowledge. And they used all sorts of ways to measure these beliefs, from Shamarba's questionnaire to Royce and Moss's PP, even King and Kitchener's reflective judgment interview.
Wow, so a pretty wide range of research methods. And what were some of the key findings?
Well, one interesting finding from Zheng and his colleagues was that students in hard domains, like engineering, tended to hold more naive beliefs about certainty and sources of knowledge, and saw learning as a more structured, orderly process compared to students in soft domains, like humanities.
Interesting.
And it seems like some of these differences were related to the level of education. Graduate students generally showed more developed beliefs than undergrads.
Okay, so maybe our beliefs about knowledge mature as we go through higher education.
Yeah, that seems to be part of the story.
What else?
Kearsley found that grad students' dominant ways of knowing varied by their field of study in ways that aligned with Royce's framework.
So future historians were thinking more like historians, and future scientists were thinking more like scientists.
Right. And Lonka and Lindblom-Yelen found that medical students had a more dualistic view of knowledge, seeing things as right or wrong compared to psychology students, which points to domain specificity. But both groups showed a developmental trend towards seeing knowledge as more relative, so maybe there's some domain generality there too.
Okay, so maybe it's a mix of both.
Seems like it. Now, the 11 within subject studies painted a bit more of a mixed picture.
Okay, so what happened when they looked at how individual students' beliefs varied across subjects?
Well, most of them still leaned towards supporting domain specificity. Students reported different beliefs about knowledge in different subjects, but they often found some level of positive correlation across domains.
So maybe there's some underlying general tendencies, but they get expressed differently depending on the subject.
Yeah, that could be it.
What were some of the highlights from those studies?
Well, even elementary students showed differences. Studolsky found that they viewed math as being based on rules, with the teacher as the authority, but saw social studies as having more diverse content where students could contribute their own ideas.
Wow, so even little kids are picking up on these different ways of knowing in different subjects.
Yeah, it seems like it starts early. Schoenfeld found that high school students saw math knowledge as being rule-based, but not necessarily black and white, which was different from their views on English and social studies. Hover found that university students saw psychology as having less certain knowledge, with personal experience as a valid source of justification, compared to science, which they viewed as more certain and reliant on authority figures.
Interesting. So psychology is more open to interpretation and personal perspectives, while science is more about objective facts and what the experts say.
Right. But she also found some moderate correlations, so there might be some general beliefs operating across those domains as well. Beale found that students' beliefs about the role of effort in learning differed depending on whether they were thinking about math or history. And Schamer-Akins actually found some support for domain generality, especially when students had similar levels of experience in the subjects being compared.
So maybe the more experience you have in different subjects, the more you start to see some common threads in how knowledge works.
That could be. So, as you can see, the research is complex, with different methods yielding slightly different results.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like there's still a lot to figure out here.
Absolutely. And that's why the article then goes into a really helpful critical analysis of the research. They look at some of the conceptual, methodological, and analytical issues that might be affecting the results.
Okay, so they're like, hold on, let's take a step back and look at the big picture here.
Exactly. They point out that different studies have used different ways of categorizing domains, which makes it hard to compare findings.
Right, like apples and oranges.
Right. And comparing broad domains like social sciences with specific domains like psychology can also muddy the waters.
Yeah, it's like, are we talking about psychology as a whole, or are we talking about different subfields within psychology?
Right, that level of specificity matters.
What about the questionnaires themselves? Did they raise any concerns about those?
Oh, yeah. They point out that some questions are too general and don't really get at epistemic beliefs directly, while others might be too specific to a particular domain. And there's inconsistency in whether they ask about the student's own views or about knowledge in general.
So some measurement issues there.
Definitely. Methodologically, they highlight the reliance on self-report questionnaires, which we know can be problematic. What people say they believe isn't always what they actually think or do.
Yeah, we're not always the best at reflecting on our own beliefs.
Right. And they point out issues with both between subjects and within subjects' designs. Like in between subjects, when you ask general belief questions without a specific subject, it's hard to know how students are interpreting those questions. Yeah. And within subjects, asking students to apply the same questions to different domains might actually influence their responses.
So the way you ask the question can affect the answer you get.
Exactly. And they point out that some measures have low reliability, and none of the studies corrected for that statistically, which could inflate the relationships they found.
Okay, so some statistical nitty-gritty there.
Yeah. And finally, they critique the over-reliance on Likert scales, arguing that they might not capture the full complexity of epistemic beliefs, especially the developmental aspects.
So those scales that are like strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, those might be too simplistic for this kind of research.
They might be, yeah. And they suggest that qualitative methods where you actually talk to students and get a deeper understanding of their thinking might be really valuable here.
Okay, makes sense.
And analytically, they critique the fact that no studies tested the underlying structure of personal epistemology across domains before doing other analyses. They also point out the difference between comparing means and correlations, which might be picking up on different aspects of the relationship between beliefs and domains. And finally, they note that even when differences were found, they were often quite small.
So even if my beliefs about math and history are different, they might not be that different overall.
Right.
Okay, so after all this critical analysis, the authors propose their own framework for understanding all of this. They call it the Theory of Integrated Domains in Epistemology, or TIDE.
Yes, the TIDE framework.
So what is this TIDE framework all about? How does it help us make sense of all this complexity?
Well, it's basically an attempt to bring together all these different findings and offer a more unified way of thinking about personal epistemology.
Okay, so it's like their grand theory of how this all works.
Yeah, you could say that.
What are the key ideas in this framework?
Well, it really emphasizes the dynamic interaction between individuals and their sociocultural contexts. It draws on developmental psychology, like Fisher and Vygotsky, emphasizing how our cognitive abilities and the demands of our environment constantly interact and shape each other.
Okay, so it's not just about what's going on in our heads, it's also about the world around us.
Exactly. And it distinguishes between general epistemic beliefs, which we start developing early on outside of school, and academic epistemic beliefs, which form once we enter formal education.
So general beliefs are like the foundation, and academic beliefs are built on top of that.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And then there are the domain-specific beliefs, which are tied to particular subjects.
Right, so those are like the specialized branches growing out of the main trunk.
Exactly. And the TIDE framework sees all these levels of belief as interconnected and influencing each other. As we specialize in a particular domain, those domain-specific beliefs become more prominent.
Okay, so it's like a multi-layered system with different levels of beliefs interacting with each other.
Right. And the framework also acknowledges the developmental progression in how we think about knowledge, from more absolute to more evaluative. But it also recognizes that our beliefs can be refined and adjusted through experience.
So we're not stuck with the beliefs we formed as kids. We can keep learning and growing.
Exactly.
Okay, so this TIDE framework seems like a pretty comprehensive way of looking at this whole thing. What are some of the implications for research and for education?
Well, it has a lot of implications. One is the importance of considering the context when measuring beliefs.
Okay.
So domain-specific questionnaires might be more appropriate for looking at how beliefs relate to performance in a particular subject, while general scales might be useful for understanding broader trends.
So the right tool for the job.
Right. It also suggests that big changes in academic settings, like transitioning from high school to college, might actually trigger a regression to earlier developmental stages.
Oh, wow. So we might temporarily revert to a more simplistic way of thinking about knowledge when we're faced with a new and challenging environment.
Yeah, that's possible. And it highlights the need for researchers to be really thoughtful about the philosophical underpinnings of domain epistemologies when they're designing measures.
So we need to be clear about what knowledge even means in different fields.
Right. There's also a lot more research needed on whether the different dimensions of personal epistemology, like certainty and source, are similar across domains, and how variations in those dimensions influence an individual's overall epistemology.
Some more work to be done there. What about the implications for education?
Well, the TIDE framework really underscores the value of making students explicitly aware of their own beliefs about knowledge,
Okay.
and encouraging them to compare and contrast how knowledge works in different subjects.
So helping students become epistemological detectives.
Exactly. That could lead to a deeper understanding of learning itself and of the different teaching approaches that are used in different fields. It also highlights the importance of teachers' own beliefs about knowledge and their ability to assess their students' epistemic development.
Right, so teachers need to be epistemologically savvy themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And the article also talks about the importance of the overall epistemic climate in educational settings.
Okay, so what's the overall vibe about knowledge and learning in a particular classroom or school?
Exactly. And they argue that we should be exposing students to the dominant ways of knowing in different fields, maybe moving away from this strict one right answer approach toward more constructivist methods that value critical thinking and acknowledge that knowledge can be complex and uncertain.
So a more nuanced and realistic view of how knowledge works in the real world.
Exactly.
So to wrap it all up, this deep dive into personal epistemology shows us that how we believe knowledge works is this really intricate mix of general tendencies and domain-specific adaptations.
And that understanding this interplay can give us incredible insights into how we learn best and how education can be designed to support that learning.
It's clear that there's still a lot more to explore in this area, but this deep dive has given us a great starting point.
Absolutely. And a final thought for our listeners. Take some time to reflect on your own beliefs about knowledge in different areas of your life. Do you approach a historical question the same way you approach a technical problem? How might understanding those differences shape your own learning and decision-making?
A great question to ponder. And if you're intrigued by all of this, we highly recommend checking out the full article and the wider research on personal epistemology. This is a fascinating journey into how we come to know what we know.
Absolutely. There's always more to learn.
And that is the goal. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.